And we're continuing with the fifth chapter of The Whispering Mountain. Owen and Mr. Smith, the king's messenger, are on their way to Pennygaff through the woods. They still have 37 miles to go, and the horse is not cooperating with Mr. Smith, so Owen is going to try some horse whispering. Owen accordingly slipped from the pony's rump and, going forward, took hold of one furry ear and whispered into it. Having no notion of what sort of soothing spells Erebus used to charm refractory horses, he decided to try the table of corn measures from his book of knowledge. 2 lasts 1 way, 10 ways 1 quarter, 20 quarters 1 comb, 80 combs 1 bushel, 320 bushels 1 peck. This had an electrifying effect. On the word peck, the pony bounded forward, as if he saw a manger full of corn ahead of him under the trees. Mr. Smith, violently dislodged from the saddle, fell sprawling. "Dang it!" he cried furiously, and leaping to his feet, made after the pony, who kept evading him and remained tantalizingly just out of reach. Owen ran round to the pony's other side and tried to grab his reins. But the wayward animal kicked up his heels and cantered to the end of the glade. "This is on account of your perilous notions," Mr. Smith said to Owen. "A right slobber you made of the business. Now what are you going to do about it?" "I don't suppose you have any carrots, sugar, or other delicacies of which horses are inordinately fond?" "I have not, and anyways, I wouldn't offer them to that son of Beelzebub." Owen reflected. "My grandfather considers that mushrooms are a delicacy. I wonder if the pony would do so too." "No knowing what whim that rug-headed prancer might take into his noodle," remarked the messenger. "Try him if you like. Only don't poison the brute. I dare say half these toady-stools is sudden death." However, Owen, aided by his useful book, was able to pick out a cluster of wood mushrooms from the various kinds of fungi which grew profusely in the vicinity. He pulled a few and broke them in pieces, then approached the pony, who watched him come with suspicion, but pricked his ears interestingly at the scent of the mushrooms. As the scent of mushrooms reached him, borne on the rising wind. "Stab me!" muttered Mr. Smith. "I do believe the unnatural animals are going to swallow the bait." The pony stuck out his neck and then lifted a lip to nibble at one of the portions of mushroom. Matters were in this delicate state when they were all startled by the sound of a low, fierce series of grunts alarmingly near at hand. With a shrill whinny, the pony flung his head and bounded aside. Owen looked swiftly round and to his horror saw an immense wild boar emerge from a clump of hazel bushes midway between him and Mr. Smith. Its bristles were a dark mahogany brown in color, its curved tusks were fully 10 inches long, and its tiny red eyes gleamed with ferocity. "The bow! The crossbow!" Mr. Smith called frantically. "You've got it, boy! Shoot the monster! Don't just stand there gawping!" Owen had slung the bow on his back. When he dismounted, hurriedly he wiped his glasses, unslung it, and fired a bolt. The boar, roused and irritated by Mr. Smith's shout, was moving in his direction, pawing the ground menacingly and shaking its huge head so that a spray of saliva flew about, while keeping its little eyes fixed on the terrified messenger. "Shoot!" Smith croaked again. The boar made a rush at him, and he dodged around a massive oak. "What ails you, boy? Do something!" he cried to Owen, who looked quickly about, picked up a stone and hurled it at the boar. Uttering a high-pitched squeal of rage, it spun around and made for him, ramping and frothing and covering the distance at fearful speed on its short, powerful legs. Shaking but resolute, Owen knelt down and took aim. At the last possible moment he launched a bolt right into the boar's open gullet. Still it came on. Desperately he pulled out another arrow and fitted it into the crossbow. Then suddenly, with a last screaming grunt, the old king boar pitched over heavily and fell dead not a yard from where Owen crouched. "Phew!" Mr. Smith emerged from behind the oak tree, fanning himself with his 3-cornered hat. "I thought we were properly lugged that time. Hey, boy, what made you take such a tarnal long time to shoot?" "Because my book says that the boar is insensible to blows on account of the thickness of his hide, so shooting him in the mouth seemed our only hope." "Huh! Well, you're certainly a cool customer," was all Mr. Smith said to that. Owen would have liked to stay and make a careful examination of the dead animal, but Mr. Smith was anxious to get on. By great good fortune, their pony, panic-stricken at the sight of the boar, had run blindly into a hazel thicket, where it had been obliged to remain, sweating and shivering, with its reins hopelessly tangled among the boughs. Docile now and subdued, it allowed itself to be mounted and made no objections to cantering off at top speed. "Likely we'll have no trouble with the nag now, at least," Mr. Smith remarked. "If I'd have thought, though, I'd have cut off one of the boar's petitoes to threat him with if he should get resty again." However, Owen had prudently stowed some of the mushrooms in his pockets. He felt sure they might prove more efficacious than frightening their mount with a boar's trotter. As it proved, though, they had no need to cajole or threaten the pony, who behaved in a meek and biddable manner for the rest of the journey. They met no more wild boars face to face, and if they chanced to hear the distant grunts of one rooting for truffles or chestnuts farther off in the forest, the very sound was enough to start the pony into a gallop. So they were able to cover the remaining distance to Pennygraph in record time, and arrived at the outskirts of the town just as a windy dusk was falling. "Is this Pennygraph, then?" Mr. Smith inquired, as they threaded their way down a narrow, empty street between little slant-roofed dwellings. "It's a doleful sort of burrow, isn't it? Where's all the folk?" "They are indoors, I suppose," Owen said doubtfully. The town did seem unusually deserted. Not a step echoed on the cobbles apart from their own. Not a light showed in the windows. Mr. Smith shouted his message about the lost prince in front of the stocks, and the gallows, and the new Habakkuk Chapel. Nobody appeared to take the slightest interest. "Is it much use making the announcement if no one hears you?" Owen ventured to ask. "I'm not paid to swabber out the folk from their houses if they don't choose to come, am I?" Mr. Smith replied. "I've let it be known 3 times in a public place that the prince is missing. That's all I'm required to do. I shan't weep millstones if he never turns up. Is this a decent inn, boy?" he asked, approaching the Dragon of Guan. "It's the only one in the town," Owen told him. "Humph! Better than a bed of prickles in the forest mouth, I suppose. Well, boy, thanks for your company. If anyone asks, you can tell them that Ebenezer Smith said you had a good stomach and in a troublesome corner." "Thank you, sir," Owen said, as this seemed high praise from the tetchy Mr. Smith, "and thank you for letting me ride with you." He returned the crossbow to Mr. Smith, who tied his pony to a staple and entered the inn. Owen went on toward the museum with a fast-beating heart. As he neared the top of the hill, he began to hear the murmur of voices, and to see the light of numerous lanterns ahead. Soon, to his astonishment, he perceived what appeared to be most of the inhabitants of Pennygaff assembled outside the museum, as many as could be entered in the courtyard. The rest, from beyond the wall, thronged as close as they could get. Owen, being thin and light on his feet, managed to wriggle and work his way toward the front of the crowd without anybody remarking him. On his way, he caught scraps of conversation. "Down with sleepers' tickets, I say! Give us back our holy harp. They say old Ystraffledite have sold the harp to buy more flint arrowheads and stuffed birds. Sold it to Lord Malin, I heard, in return for a pension and a house in Pontypool. His grandson took the harp over to Carmalin 5 nights ago. Sif Arthur Jones told me. Arco stabbed, foul crime it is. Thief, word dog, thief!" Horrified by these unjust accusations, Owen, who by now had reached the middle of the courtyard, lifted his voice and shouted, "That's a lie! My granddad is not a thief. He has not stolen the harp." A thunderous silence fell. The people who were standing close around Owen drew away from him in a semicircle so that he was left alone midway between the crowd and the museum entrance. "Young Owen Hughes, that is," he heard somebody whisper. "The old Rabbler's grandson, come back, maybe, from disposing of the harp at Carmalin." Then the silence about him changed its quality and became steely cold. Although he had caught no sound from the museum, Owen turned instinctively, sensing that the people in the crowd had shifted their attention to something behind him. Old Mr. Hughes had come out and was standing in front of the door, staring at the crowd. He seemed quite calm, totally unmoved by their accusations, but when he saw Owen, his face set like granite. "Ah," he said, "it's you, is it? Well, what have you come back for?" And that's the end of Chapter 5.